From U.S. Congress to the state capitol, the 2022 midterms are here. What issues ring loudest with voters? Political consultants from the right.
Number one is crime. We're seeing crime spike in all of our target elections. And then the second one that we're seeing quite a bit is affordability. People are just having to make hard decisions.
And the left.
There was polling in the spring that really looked like there was going to be a red wave in Washington state.
Weigh in on the races to watch and the problem with polling.
You can, spend $25,000 on a poll and it's obsolete the next week.
What do they expect when the dust settles? That's all coming up on The Impact. Hello and welcome to The Impact. I'm Mike McClanahan. If you don't already have your ballot, the deadline for election officers to mail them out is Friday, October 21st, and the 18-day voting period begins. This fall, Washington voters will decide all 98 seats in the State House of Representatives and just over half of the positions in the State Senate, 25 of 49. All 10 of Washington's congressional seats, one of 2 U.S. Senate seats, and a split-term Washington Secretary of State vacancy are all up for grabs this year. Currently, in the U.S. House, there are 220 Democratic representatives, 212 Republican representatives, and 3 vacancies. In the U.S. Senate, there are 48 Democratic senators and 2 independents who caucus with them. There are 50 Republican senators. At the state level, Republicans hope to pick up seats in the House and Senate, but face an uphill battle to gain control over either. In Olympia, Democratic majorities control both chambers of the Washington State Legislature. The balance of power is 57-41 in the State House and 28-21 in the State Senate. Joining me now, Democratic political consultant Sandeep Kaushik of Soundview Strategies and Republican political consultant Justin Matheson of Axiom Strategies. Thank you both for your time today. The first question I'd like to hear from you, Justin. In your opinion, what issues matter the most in this election to voters in Washington?
Number one is crime. We're seeing crime spike in all of our target elections that we're going. And then the second one that we're seeing quite a bit is affordability. People are just having to make hard decisions. I was just driving down here today, and I had to pay $6 to get gas in my car, and I think people are making some hard family choices on that. And then there are some other issues. Education, we've seen in our polling has popped up quite a bit in the last couple rounds of surveys. I think there are concerns about test scores and how their kids are performing, especially after COVID, as key issues. And then, and we're seeing with the Dobbs decision, of course, we're seeing abortion as being heavily driven in this election, and I think it's partly because of the national politics that's going on and all the advertising that we're seeing on the abortion discussion. But we're seeing it in our numbers as well. It's affecting smaller groups of people, but it's motivating a certain, from our perspective, low propensity Democrats to go out and vote, and it helps them on their base level.
Well, what do you think about that, Sandeep?
Well, yeah, I agree that inflation and the economy generally is obviously a top issue, and I do think every time you go fill up your tank of gas and it's $75 or $80, that registers with people and creates a lot of anxiety and concern. So that's real. Crime is an issue. It sort of varies, I think, depending on where you're at in the state or what kind of race we're talking about crime. But I will say on the Democrats, and I think those issues generally right now, given the Democrats in control in Washington, D.C. and holding the presidency, those issues right now tend to sort of favor Republicans a little bit. We see in all the national polling, and I think that's true locally as well. That said, abortion rights, there was polling in the spring that really looked like there was going to be a red wave in Washington state and over issues like the economy and inflation and crime. And then the Dobbs decision happened, and I think it really reshaped the entire political landscape in the state. And we saw in the primary results, there wasn't any indication of a red wave whatsoever. Legislatively, if you projected out those results, Democrats would have actually gained a seat in the House based on the primary results. And I think that was very largely due to the Dobbs decision. So I think that is a big issue. The other issue I will highlight is protecting our democracy, or the threat to our democracy in some of the races, including the one I'm working on in Southwest Washington, where my candidate's running against an election denier. Our polling shows that is a top issue. People are worried about these folks running around saying, the only legitimate election is the one that my side wins.
Do you care to respond to that? Anything? Do you agree?
It's in that district. I think yes, that's actually going to be a big issue. We're not seeing that pop up in any of our, our legislative targets and things like that, just because it's so disconnected with what's going on in D.C. for the most part. Washington is very unique, and I think a lot of our issues here are kind of really focusing on essentially what's being done around the kitchen table. So in this area,
So in 2010, in 2014, and 2018, we saw waves. Those were midterm elections. Do you think this is obviously this is not shaping up to be one of those from your perspective, Sandeep?
I think, again, like looking in the spring, I think a lot of people were worried that there was a red wave coming. I don't think it looks that way now. I mean, I think in the federal races nationally, there's some question. There has been some indications of some movement back towards Republicans in the last few weeks. Could that over the last, it's all very volatile. So it's really hard to know what's going to happen over the next 3 weeks. That said, right now, I don't think we're seeing some kind of massive wave election the way we saw, say, in 2006, where, Democrats made, 36 pickups in congressional races, or when Republicans picked up 63 seats in 2010 in Congress. I don't know that it looks that way, but I will say on the federal level, the Democrats' margin in both the House and the Senate are so narrow that it would take only relatively minor shifts for Republicans to take control of both the House and the Senate at the federal level.
Yeah, on the national side, I mean, you need 218 to win, and when you go through like real code politics, and the problem is it's so fluid, right?
Yeah.
Like if we had this interview a week ago, we would be giving different answers.
That's
because things keep going up and down, and they keep moving it on categories on what they're targeting. But currently, I think they have it at 221 right now, leaning towards the Republicans in the House, and which gives them enough to do it. But there's still, and I think it's from a national side, it's a little different than what we're seeing legislative here. Is that we're playing in a lot more Democratic races, as in the toss-ups. Like in the congressional side, like 32 of the toss-up races are Democratic seats, where 5 of the top toss-up races are in Republican seats. So Republicans have nationally the most to gain, but here in Washington, some of those like red waves we've talked about. I mean, we saw. I've been doing this 24 years, but like 2014, it was a big year for us here in Washington. Solidifying our majority in the Senate, and a lot of that's to do with like other things that were affecting on the ballot. Then, like in that time, it was Obamacare was pushing some of the debate. But then you go into 2018, and we were on the other side of that because it was essentially a mandate against Donald Trump. And essentially what happened in those races is we saw in a midterm election in Washington state, Democrats turn out at higher than presidential numbers. And that was a big wave for them. Are we feeling it in the polling now, like a wave? Nationally, I think it is leaning towards the Republicans, but right now it kind of feels status quo here in Washington.
I agree with that. In terms of the legislative races, when I look at the legislative map, maybe you could see a marginal gain on the Republican side, or maybe a marginal gain on the Democratic side, but it feels like there's not going to be a big change if the election were held today. And again, I totally agree that it's incredibly volatile and stuff has been moving around. So who knows what it'll feel like in 2 weeks? But right now, there was talk in the spring that, dire talk among Democrats that we could lose one or both of the legislative houses, and some of the polling was really pretty pretty bad back then, and that's and as I said, there's been even some movement, I think, on the legislative race side in the last few weeks, favoring Republicans, but not the kind of movement that will actually flip some of these races. There is, I think, as the Washington State Republican Party has increasingly nationalized and become more and more Trumpy and kind of associated with Trump and the sort of Fox News thing, that doesn't play well in large swaths of Washington State. And it's just you can't run candidates who are sort of Trumpy election deniers in a lot of these districts and expect to win.
And they're still using that message, even with, like, I have candidates that were, I would even say, not Trumpers and pro-choice, and we still get the Trump message in there that we have to battle with, even in certain parts of Washington. But I think the other thing to look at too is like what's going on with the U.S. Senate race, because the one thing that is different this cycle, that from our side perspective, is we've really never had a fully funded U.S. Senate candidate in the past. Like, most of this stuff has been predetermined, and so when it came down to the actual elections here in Washington, it was pretty much, if you were in a major target that year, and again, going back to 2018, where we had the 26th and the 42nd were all the major targets. The difference between the votes in the 26th was 100 votes in the Senate. It was 47 votes in the Senate. But there was not, the U.S. Senate race wasn't competitive, and I think Tiffany Smiley now has got $12 million. We haven't seen a candidate raise that kind of money in a decade on a statewide level, and it's going to be interesting to see how that impacts some of the races, because most of those races have been kind of distant by the time we got to the election. And if if that tightened up, and we've seen polls all over the place. I mean, Cook just moved it from a likely Democrat to a hard Democrat to a likely Democratic seat. But if that thing is within, if they're pulling some numbers that some of the other candidates in the past have gotten like up to 46% on some of those, or it's a 5 to 8 point seat, that will have impact on some of those tighter legislative races down ticket. And we asked the questions on the U.S. Senate race and all those races, and they're pretty close in some of those swing seats. And we think that will, again, kind of going back to the whole, is it going to be a wave? No. Will there be some potential pickups on the Republican side? Yeah, I think so.
So just let's shift gears and look at Olympia for just a minute here. One of the districts that is being really watched, the 42nd legislative district, I think that you maybe are...
I'm doing Simon Sebzik's in the Senate race.
So you've got an incumbent Republican senator here who was appointed to the seat of a longtime Republican senator who passed away. You've got a Democratic sitting representative who's giving up that seat to challenge in that district. In the last election, I believe Democrats flipped both House seats there, or they controlled both.
Yeah, we held the Senate. They flipped both of the
House, and so now Representative Sharon Shoemake wants to make that completely blue district, wants to flip that. Do you see this race as an indication of, or rather this election as an indication of whether or not gains that maybe have been made by the Democratic Party in Puget Sound and surrounding areas in what were considered swing areas may be permanent Democratic gains, or are we not there yet?
I don't think we're there yet. It's hard to say with some of the new districts that have been cut. Some of the, we're going to have some new districts that we're going to be able to deal with. And I think if we get past 2024, when we've done another round of people running in some of those new seats, those gains could absolutely be solidified. I think that I think the 42nd is a huge district, and it's one of those things. It's a must-win for Republicans, because there's no path to a majority if a race like that is lost. And if they pick up the 26 again, then it puts them back on a different foot going into the 2024 election. So. Yeah.
I agree. I think both of those districts right now are the 26th and the 42nd are and I would add in the 10th district to that are
The
really
the 47th. too,
yeah,
there.
I think are really the swing districts of this the sort of toss-up districts of this election, and I don't. If I remember correctly, I think Shoemake was finished second in the primary, but I think that race is very, very close. I think it could go either way. I think the same thing in the 26 where Emily Randall came out ahead in the primary, but I think there's a lot of money that's getting spent down there, and I think that's a very, very close race.
Representative Jesse Young, the challenger.
Yeah.
We always used to look at the primaries as like, okay, it's an indicator of what's going to happen. And in the last like 3 cycles, it's been a change in that, because we just have the primaries tend to be a little bit more partisan. You get the Republicans that show up that are pretty active, and you get the Democrats that show up that are pretty active, and then you just get this big universe of swing voters, and you call them true independents, and sometimes that could surge up to 40% in the general. And so the candidate that can stay out of the extreme from one way or the other is going to be the one that's going to be successful in the general. And I think in the House, like just going back to 2020, there was like 13 races where the Republicans were down, and 10 of them they came back to win it in the general. And so we kind of throw out that whole the primary determines everything, but it does determine like. It does have an effect on it, because what happens is if you lose the primary, then your money dries up. The lobbyists don't think you can win, and some of the races they have like this foregone conclusion because they didn't get funded. So then you automatically lose. But I think these are going to be between these 2 races. I think we're going to look at the same kind of numbers that we did in 2018. I mean, it's going to come down to a few hundred votes. In some of our key targets, the 42nd, the 26th, and we won't know on election night. We probably won't know from 2 weeks from election night on who won those elections.
I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit and throw out one race that I think people aren't paying a ton of attention to right now, but I think could surprise folks, and that's I think it's the 31st, right? It's the race where Chris Vance, a former chair of the state Republican Party, but left. He's a never Trump. Person who left the party and is now running as an independent candidate against Phil Fortunato, a very kind of hard right Republican. Chris's numbers weren't that great in the primary, but to your point, I do think there's a difference between the general election electorate where you bring out a lot more kind of less ideological voters, right? Somebody where Chris, with his sort of independent credentials now and his message, may have a lot more appeal. At getting those folks to swing his way, and so that's a race I'm watching closely. I could see Chris pulling that one off. Yeah.
So we got about 5 minutes left. I want to hit on a couple of other topics in terms of the stakes for voters out there. What difference will it make at the state level? Democrats have big majorities in the House and Senate right now, or a big majority in the House and a significant majority in the state Senate. Republicans would have to pick up 9 seats in the House, I believe, and then 4 seats in the Senate.
Yeah, the likelihood that the Republicans win the majority in both the Senate and the House in this election is not going to happen. I mean, it puts them on a path, if they have gains, but for the most part, I think it's just what direction the state wants to go. Because if it goes the other direction, then you're potentially going to have a lot larger. Extremely liberal component that's running Olympia, and so things will get a little bit more drastic going to the left. I think if the Republicans have mild gains, then it would actually embolden the moderates in Olympia to be more effective, because if you need 4 votes to swing a bill, the moderates are going to be able to team up with on both the Democrats and the Republican side are going to be able to team up together and get things done kind of more in the middle if it's closer. So
what do you think?
I think that's right. If there are some Republican gains coming out of this election, which I don't know that there will be, but yeah, I think it's hard to say right now. But if there are, particularly on the Senate side, I think it could affect the complexion of how things play out in Olympia during the legislative session. And I would also think, if there's indications that say the crime issue has resonated and sort of helped put some of these Republican candidates over the top in some of these close races, I think that could have an impact on my side in thinking about how we address some of these issues around, you know, and how to talk about policing and criminal justice and stuff like that. Look, I think Democrats, you know, have already kind of, most Democrats, I think, have distanced themselves from the whole quote unquote defund the police kind of stuff that we saw in Seattle in 2020. But nonetheless, there are, you know, crime, as we talked about earlier, crime is an issue that's getting talked about in these races, and I think Republicans sense that they have some wind at their backs on that issue, and so, you know, we'll see how it, you know, what the outcomes are. On the other hand, if I think Democrats end up picking up, say, picking up a House seat, even with their large majorities, I think that will, embolden the more progressive wing of the party, saying, you know, they threw everything at us and turned out it didn't work. None of it stuck.
So let's talk about polling briefly. We've just got a couple of minutes left here. But after 2016, when so many polls had Hillary Clinton winning that presidential election, Donald Trump won the election that year. That was considered a big polling upset, at least. So a lot of people maybe lost confidence in polls in terms of, are they valuable? Has polling been fixed, or what are the challenges with polls?
Well, it depends, you know, it depends on what poll you're talking about, because there's some really good folks out there that are really doing some good polling, and then there's some garbage going around. You know, people throw stuff online and they call it a poll, and then people are believing that's effective. I mean, every pollster will tell you that the challenge right now is actually getting people to answer their phones. And so what happens is they're pushing out polls with low survey samples, and so higher margin of errors. And, you know, so if you're running a poll that's on a statewide that's like a 6-point margin of error, I mean, that's 6 points one way or the other, and that's the difference between winning and losing. I think the key is like the averages. Like, you know, you got to just kind of watch all of them going out. And I think that's like, you know, when we talk about real code politics and stuff, they kind of put everything and kind of average things out, because and use a lot more mixed mode, where you're using different ways to connect people through online and things like that, and texting, you know, so you get a bigger sample, and then actually getting the turnout right. You know, some of the people miss the polling because they don't get their turnout models correctly as a turnout. But I think I think, you know, I think they're all kind of in the space, but you know, right now everything is so fluid that literally, like, you can, you know, spend $25,000 on a poll and it's obsolete the next week because of the way the electric.
I would just really quickly say the volatility is real, and the other thing that you just mentioned, the turnout model is really different. Usually what we do with polling is we try to go back and historically say, okay, what was the demographic, you know, shape of the electorate of the similar election 4 years ago, or, you know, 8 years ago, and then kind of use that historical model to kind of weight our samples. But, you know, in recent races, who turns out has really varied a lot,
like,
right? You know,
back to 2018, where we talked about the Democrats turned out at a higher than president.
Yeah,
we haven't seen that going back to the 60s. And so to understand how those polls were going to work, the models were all wrong.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, you end up with the wrong sample, and therefore your numbers are all off. And that this volatility of, you know, is there going to be, you know, in 2020, I think in a lot of districts in Washington State, there were a lot more conservative voters in those, you know, in some parts of the state that turned out than people expected. And so on the Democratic side, I think a lot of the polling was off in 2020 in legislative races, where, and it was all because of the turnout was different from what we kind of expected historically. And when you've got a very polarized electorate kind of on both sides, that adds a new layer of sort of volatility of who's the most motivated and who's really wound up and who turns out, and it makes it a you know, it was always more art than science to begin with, and this just makes it even more, you know.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. But again, Justin Matheson, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Cindy Castro, thank you for your time. We appreciate your perspective and for just sharing it with our viewers.
Thank you for having us on.
Still ahead, the fate of Capitol Lake. That's coming up. Stay with us. A final recommendation about the future of Capitol Lake in Olympia will be announced by Halloween. That's the deadline for a decision announced by the state agency in charge of the property. DES, the Department of Enterprise Services, has convened various work groups to weigh different options for the lake. The agency is expected to recommend converting the lake back into an estuary. Capitol Lake was created by the construction of the Fifth Avenue Dam that severed the connection between the Deschutes River and Puget Sound in 1951. Estuary supporters hope to restore balance to the ecosystem and improve water quality. Advocates of a plan to preserve and improve the lake are concerned about the change to downtown Olympia's aesthetic and the marina waterfront. That's a wrap for this week. Join us next Wednesday for more in-depth interviews you won't find anywhere else. I'm Mike McClanahan. Thanks for watching and have a great week.